The sun shone brightly as the Johnson family arrived at the airport, filled with excitement and anticipation. It was a special day for them. After saving for months, they finally had the chance to fly first class on their long-awaited vacation. The family, parents, Marcus and Erica, and their two children, Jamal and Kira, could hardly believe their luck. Marcus had always dreamed of flying in first class, imagining the extra comfort, the better food, and of course, the spacious seats. Erica was just as excited, though she couldn't help but think of the long journey ahead. Jamal and Kira, both young and full of energy, were thrilled about the adventure. For them, every step of the airport process, checking in, going through security, and finding their gate, felt like a part of a grand adventure. As they made their way to the gate, the family couldn't help but notice how comfortable everything seemed in first class. The seats were large and plush, the food menus looked fancy, and the flight attendants were extra polite. The family had flown before, but this was their first time in such a luxurious section of the plane. They couldn't wait to relax in their seats and enjoy the flight. When the time came, the flight attendants called for first-class passengers to board. Marcus, Erica, Jamal, and Kira walked down the jet bridge with smiles on their faces. They showed their boarding passes to the gate agents, who smiled back, nodding politely. Everything was going smoothly, or so they thought. They walked through the door to the first-class cabin and found their seats. Marcus and Erica sat together in the first row, while Jamal and Kira happily took their seats next to them. The children were excited about the extra space and the fact that they could watch movies on the individual screens. They settled in, preparing for the flight ahead. But as they settled into their seats, something felt strange. The flight attendants were no longer smiling as they passed by. They glanced at the Johnson family briefly, then looked away. The family tried to brush it off, thinking nothing of it at first. After all, they had done everything right, booked the tickets, paid for first class, and followed all the instructions. However, the mood in the cabin soon started to shift. The family noticed a couple of murmurs from the flight attendants as they whispered to each other near the back of the cabin. The Johnsons tried to ignore it, thinking they were just imagining things. But then, the supervisor of the flight crew walked over to them. "Excuse me," the supervisor began, her tone polite but firm. "There seems to be a mistake with your seating assignment. I'm afraid you'll need to move to the coach section." The family looked at each other, confused. "A mistake? But we booked first class," Marcus replied, his voice steady but filled with concern. "We've double-checked the system," the supervisor said. "You'll need to move." The family was stunned. They had followed all the rules, paid for their seats in advance, and had been looking forward to the experience. They didn't understand why they were being asked to move. Marcus stood up, his hands slightly shaking but trying to stay calm. "There must be some mistake," he said. "We've already checked in, and we paid for these seats. We're not moving." The supervisor looked at him for a moment, then nodded before walking away, but not without casting an uneasy glance back at the family. The air in the cabin seemed to grow heavier, and Marcus could sense the growing tension. As they waited in their seats, the Johnsons couldn't help but feel uncomfortable. They tried to stay calm, but the whispers from the flight attendants and the sense that something wasn't right left them uneasy. They hoped it was just a misunderstanding, but deep down, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being treated differently. The family looked at one another, unsure of what would happen next. As the minutes passed, the Johnson family continued to sit in their first-class seats, feeling a mix of confusion and unease. The flight crew was no longer making eye contact with them, and the atmosphere had changed. It was as if something was building beneath the surface, and the Johnsons could feel it. Erica glanced at Marcus, her brow furrowed with concern. "Do you think it's just a mistake?" she whispered, not wanting to raise her voice. She was trying to make sense of the situation, but everything felt off. "I don't know," Marcus replied quietly, trying to keep calm for the sake of their children. "But it doesn't feel like a mistake. It's more than that." Jamal and Kira, sensing the tension, sat quietly in their seats. They had been looking forward to the flight, excited about all the new experiences, but now they couldn't help but notice the change in the air. Kira, the younger of the two, tugged on her father's sleeve. "Why are the people staring at us?" she asked in a soft voice. Marcus smiled, trying to reassure her. "Don't worry, sweetheart. It's probably nothing." But inside, his worry was growing. The flight attendants continued to move around the cabin, but they avoided looking at the family. A few passengers in first class were casting curious glances toward them, and a couple of people even whispered to each other. The Johnsons felt like they were under a microscope. Then the supervisor appeared again, walking quickly toward their seats. This time, she had a stern expression on her face, and she was accompanied by another flight attendant. The family exchanged uneasy glances. Something was definitely happening, and it didn't seem like a simple mistake anymore. "Excuse me, sir," the supervisor said, her voice cold but polite. "We're going to have to ask you to move to the coach section. We've spoken to the booking system, and there's a serious error." Marcus stood up, his voice steady but firm. "I've already told you, we've paid for these seats. We aren't going anywhere." He could feel his heart racing, and he knew this wasn't just about seating. Something was wrong. Erica nodded in agreement. "We've been polite and patient. We're not leaving." The supervisor hesitated for a moment, as if considering how to handle the situation. Then she turned to the other flight attendant and whispered something to her. The air felt tense as the family watched, unsure of what would happen next. As the seconds passed, Marcus began to feel more and more uncomfortable. It was clear that the flight attendants weren't just confused about a booking mistake. They were trying to force them out of first class, and the reason seemed to be something deeper, something that they couldn't put into words. Jamal and Kira stayed quiet, not fully understanding what was happening, but sensing the change in the atmosphere. They watched their parents closely, seeing the worry in their eyes, and it made them uneasy too. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the supervisor walked away, muttering something about checking with the captain. The family sat in silence, unsure of what to do. They had followed all the rules, and yet they were being treated like they didn't belong. Marcus looked at Erica, then at their children. "We're not moving," he said quietly but with determination. "We have a right to be here, and we're not going anywhere." The tension in the cabin felt like it was building to something, but no one knew how it would end. The family stayed in their seats, waiting for whatever was to come next. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling longer than the last. The Johnson family sat in their seats, hands clenched and hearts racing, as they waited for the flight crew to return. The air was thick with tension, and it seemed like everyone in the first-class cabin was watching them. The quiet murmurs from the other passengers felt louder now, like a weight pressing down on them. Marcus kept his eyes on the supervisor as she spoke with another crew member near the back of the cabin. He could hear their hushed voices, though he couldn't make out the words. He turned to Erica and tried to speak calmly. "This doesn't feel right. I don't know what's going on, but they're treating us like we don't belong here." Erica nodded, her face full of worry. She kept her voice low. "Maybe it's a misunderstanding. They'll figure it out, right?" But Marcus wasn't so sure. The way the flight attendants had acted, avoiding eye contact, whispering to each other, it was starting to feel personal, like something more than a simple mix-up. Jamal and Kira sat quietly between them, confused but sensing the shift in the mood. Kira looked up at her parents, her eyes wide. "Why aren't we flying yet, Mommy?" "Just a little more time, sweetie," Erica said, forcing a smile. "Everything will be fine." But Marcus could feel the anger bubbling inside him. He had worked hard to make this trip special for his family, and now it felt like they were being treated unfairly for reasons he couldn't understand. He stood up abruptly, his voice shaking but steady. "Excuse me," he called to the flight attendants. "Can you please explain what's going on? We've done everything right. We paid for these seats, and there's no reason for us to be moved." The supervisor, who had been standing at the back of the cabin, turned at the sound of his voice. She quickly walked over, her expression unchanged, but there was a flicker of something. Uncertainty. Annoyance. Marcus couldn't tell. "Sir, as I've already explained," she said, trying to maintain her polite tone, "there has been a mistake with your booking. I need you to move to the coach section." Her voice was firm, but something in her eyes suggested that she wasn't entirely comfortable with the situation either. "I don't think you understand," Marcus said, his voice rising just a bit. "There's no mistake. We're in the right seats, and we're not going anywhere." The other passengers in first class had started to take notice. Some were watching the scene unfold with curiosity, while others exchanged whispers. Marcus could feel the stares, but he wasn't going to back down. He wasn't going to let his family be treated this way. Erica looked at him, concern in her eyes. "Marcus, maybe we should just—" "No," Marcus interrupted. "We're staying right here. This is our seat, and we paid for it." Just then, the door to the cockpit opened, and a flight attendant stepped out. The supervisor turned and walked toward the cockpit, no doubt to consult with the captain. For a few moments, the cabin was silent, but the tension was still there, hanging in the air. Jamal leaned over to Kira and whispered, "Why don't they want us here, Kira?" Kira didn't answer. She just looked up at her father, who was standing tall, his arms crossed, his jaw set with determination. She wasn't sure what was happening, but she trusted him. He always made things right. As the minutes ticked by, Marcus could feel the eyes of everyone in the cabin on him and his family. He didn't know how this was going to end, but he was ready to fight for what was right. He would not let his family be pushed aside. Just as the tension in the cabin seemed to reach its peak, something unexpected happened. From across the aisle, a voice rang out, calm, but filled with authority. The voice belonged to none other than a famous celebrity who had been quietly observing the situation from her seat in the first row. Her presence in first class had gone unnoticed at first, but now, everyone in the cabin turned their attention to her as she stood up and walked toward the flight crew. "Excuse me," the celebrity said, her voice carrying clearly across the quiet cabin. "What's going on here?" The flight attendants and the supervisor turned toward her, surprised by her sudden intervention. The supervisor seemed a little taken aback, but quickly regained her composure. "We're dealing with a seating issue," the supervisor said stiffly, though there was a hint of uncertainty in her voice. "This family has been placed in the wrong section, and we need to move them." The celebrity raised an eyebrow. "I see. And what exactly is the issue with their seating?" she asked, her tone steady but now more serious. "There's been a mistake with their booking," the supervisor replied, clearly uncomfortable under the celebrity's scrutiny. "They were supposed to be seated in coach, but somehow they ended up in first class. We're just trying to resolve it." The celebrity looked at the family, who were still sitting calmly in their seats, trying to hold on to their dignity despite the growing discomfort. She turned back to the supervisor. "I don't see what the problem is. These people paid for their seats, right? There's no reason to ask them to move." The flight attendants exchanged nervous glances, unsure how to respond to this new development. The celebrity's words had already shifted the mood in the cabin. Passengers who had been watching the scene unfold now seemed more curious than ever. Some passengers were even nodding in agreement, and the atmosphere seemed to lighten, if only slightly. "You don't understand," the supervisor replied, clearly flustered. "We've been instructed to move them. It's just a mistake." The celebrity was no longer willing to accept this explanation. She stepped forward and addressed the family directly. "I'm sorry for what you're going through," she said, her voice kind and full of understanding. "This is completely unfair. I'm here to help." The family was taken aback by the celebrity's kindness. They hadn't expected anyone, especially someone famous, to step in and support them in this way. They had felt isolated up until now, but suddenly someone was speaking up for them. Marcus took a deep breath. his tension easing slightly as he saw the celebrity's genuine concern. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft but full of gratitude. "We don't understand why this is happening. We've done everything by the book." "I can see that," the celebrity replied. She turned back to the supervisor, her tone firm now. "If there's an issue with their booking, you need to figure it out, but you can't just remove them from their seats. They belong here just like anyone else." The flight attendants looked at each other, and for the first time, it seemed like they didn't have an answer. The celebrity's words had caught them off guard, and they seemed unsure of how to respond. The supervisor hesitated, looking at the other flight attendants for support, but no one spoke up. The cabin remained still, but the celebrity's presence was a calming force. The other passengers were now watching intently, sensing that something important was happening. The flight attendants, who had been so sure of themselves before, now appeared uncertain. The celebrity's intervention had already begun to change the situation. Her support had given the family a sense of hope and strength. The passengers were no longer passive observers. Many of them were beginning to quietly voice their agreement with the celebrity's stance. As the minutes passed, it was clear that something had shifted in the cabin. The pressure on the flight attendants was mounting, and the Johnson family could feel it. They had no idea what would happen next, but they knew one thing for sure. They were no longer alone. The situation in the cabin had changed. What had started as a tense confrontation was now growing into something more. The celebrity's presence had shifted the balance, and the flight crew seemed less certain of their next steps. For the Johnson family, it was a moment of unexpected relief. They had been feeling alone, facing a challenge they couldn't quite understand. But now, someone was standing up for them. The celebrity stood confidently, her posture calm but assertive. She had become the center of attention, and it was clear that the flight crew didn't know how to respond. The supervisor shifted nervously from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "We've already spoken to the booking department," the supervisor said, trying to maintain her composure. "They've confirmed the error, and we've been instructed to move them." The celebrity raised a hand, cutting her off. "I understand that you're following instructions, but that doesn't mean what's happening is right. These people paid for their seats, just like everyone else here. There's no reason they should be asked to leave." The flight attendants exchanged glances, unsure how to proceed. The supervisor hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the celebrity's insistence. She turned to the other attendants, who remained silent, waiting for her to make a decision. Marcus, still standing beside his seat, watched as the conversation unfolded. He felt a wave of gratitude toward the celebrity. She had taken the time to understand their side of the story, and now she was using her influence to help them. It was a relief, but also a bit overwhelming. They hadn't expected to have someone of her stature step in and support them. "I don't want to cause trouble," the supervisor said quietly, "but we've been told this is a serious issue. We need to clear it up." The celebrity shook her head, her tone gentle but firm. "There's no need to clear anything up. The Johnson family belongs in these seats. If there's a mistake, it's on your end, not theirs. You need to fix it." The celebrity's words hung in the air, and for a moment, the entire cabin was silent. Passengers were watching, some nodding in agreement, others looking uncertain. It was as though the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted completely. The flight crew, who had been so certain of themselves moments before, now seemed uncertain. Erica leaned over to Marcus, her voice barely a whisper. "Do you think this will work? Will they listen to her?" "I don't know," Marcus replied quietly, "but we have to hope so. We can't just give up." The children, who had been sitting quietly in their seats, looked around at the growing crowd of passengers watching the scene unfold. They didn't fully understand what was happening, but they could tell that their parents were no longer alone in this fight. The sense of solidarity was clear, even if the situation still felt uncomfortable. Finally, the supervisor turned to the celebrity, her voice softer now. "I'll need to check with the captain, but I understand your point. I'll see what I can do." The celebrity nodded, her expression calm. "That's all I'm asking. Just make sure the family is treated fairly." As the supervisor walked away, the cabin remained quiet, with passengers watching the situation unfold. Marcus and Erica exchanged a look of relief. The tension was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, they felt hopeful. The celebrity had spoken up for them when no one else had, and that alone had given them a new sense of confidence. Whatever happened next, they knew they wouldn't have to face it alone. As the minutes ticked by, the Johnson family sat in silence, their hearts racing with uncertainty. The celebrity's intervention had given them hope, but they still didn't know how this situation would end. Would the flight crew apologize and let them stay in their seats? Or would they be forced to move, no matter how unfair it felt? The flight attendants had gathered at the back of the cabin, speaking in hushed voices, occasionally glancing toward the family. The supervisor had walked off to speak with the captain, but no one knew what was happening behind the closed cockpit door. The family could feel the weight of the silence, but they tried to stay calm. Jamal shifted in his seat, leaning over to whisper to his sister, Kira, "Do you think they'll make us leave?" Kira shrugged, looking up at her parents with wide, worried eyes. "I don't know, but Daddy's not letting them do it. He's strong." Marcus overheard his daughter's words, and he smiled at her. "Don't worry, kiddo," he said gently. "We're going to be fine. We'll work this out." As the family exchanged quiet words of reassurance, something unexpected happened. One by one, passengers began to speak up. At first, it was just a few murmurs from across the cabin. But as more voices joined in, the support grew louder and more confident. "I don't understand why they're being asked to move," one passenger said, her voice calm but firm. "They're in the right seats. It seems like a mistake on the airline's part, not theirs." Another passenger, a man sitting a few rows behind the Johnsons, leaned forward and added, "I'm with you. If there's a mistake, it should be on the airline to fix it, not on them." The words of support started to spread. More people began to speak up, voicing their agreement with the family. It wasn't just one or two people anymore. It was a growing group of passengers who were standing behind the Johnsons. "I'm a frequent flyer," one woman said, "and I've never seen anything like this. If they paid for those seats, they should be allowed to stay." End of story. The energy in the cabin began to shift. What had felt like a tense standoff was now becoming a shared stand for fairness. The passengers weren't just observing anymore. They were actively supporting the family, encouraging them to hold their ground. Marcus and Erica exchanged a glance, their eyes wide with surprise. They hadn't expected this kind of support. For the first time since the issue had started, they felt like they weren't alone. People were speaking out, not just for the Johnson family, but for what was right. The children, still sitting quietly, sensed the change in the atmosphere. Kira turned to her mother and whispered, "Mommy, do you think we're going to stay in our seats now?" "I hope so, sweetheart," Erica whispered back, squeezing her daughter's hand. "I think we're going to be okay." Meanwhile, the flight attendants continued to huddle at the back of the cabin. The pressure building as more and more passengers voiced their support for the family. It was clear that the situation was no longer just between the Johnsons and the flight crew. It had become something bigger. The passengers were making their voices heard, and it was clear that they didn't agree with the way the family had been treated. As the minutes stretched on, the flight crew looked increasingly uncomfortable. The murmurs of support continued to fill the cabin, and the supervisor had yet to return. It was clear that the flight attendants were being forced to reconsider their stance as the passengers' voices were growing louder. The Johnsons remained seated, their hearts lighter now, knowing that they had the support of those around them. Whatever came next, they weren't facing it alone. The situation was far from over, but they had a sense that change was coming, and they were ready to stand their ground. The minutes felt like hours as the Johnson family waited in their seats. Every eye in the cabin was on them, and the tension in the air was thick. The support from the other passengers had given them hope, but they still didn't know how the flight crew would respond. Would the captain side with the family, or would they be forced to move? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the supervisor returned. She walked down the aisle slowly, her face unreadable. She paused in front of the Johnson family, who had been sitting quietly, waiting for a resolution. The supervisor took a deep breath before speaking. "Sir, ma'am, I've spoken with the captain and the booking department," she said, her tone now much softer than before. "I've also taken into account the support we've received from other passengers. After reviewing the situation, I'm happy to inform you that you can remain in your seats. There was no error with your booking." Marcus and Erica looked at each other in disbelief. They had been bracing for the worst, but now they were hearing something they had hoped for. For a moment, neither of them could speak. The relief that washed over them was overwhelming. "Thank you," Marcus said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "We really appreciate this." The supervisor nodded, her expression now warmer than before. "I'm sorry for the confusion earlier. It shouldn't have happened. We'll make sure there are no more issues for the rest of your flight." As the supervisor walked away, the cabin erupted into a soft murmur of approval. Passengers exchanged smiles and nods, some offering small applause. It was clear that the atmosphere had changed completely. What had been an uncomfortable and tense situation just moments ago was now a moment of triumph for the Johnson family, and for everyone who had supported them. Erica turned to Marcus, her eyes sparkling with gratitude. "I can't believe it. We're really staying." "I know," Marcus said, his smile growing wider. "I didn't expect this, but I'm glad we stood our ground." Jamal and Kira, who had been sitting quietly during the whole ordeal, finally let out breaths they hadn't realized they were holding. Jamal grinned, his youthful excitement returning. "So we get to stay in first class." "That's right," Marcus said, chuckling as he ruffled Jamal's hair. "We're not going anywhere." As the family relaxed back into their seats, a sense of calm began to settle over them. They could finally enjoy the flight they had worked so hard for. The passengers around them were smiling too, some giving them thumbs up or nodding in approval. It was a quiet but powerful show of support. The celebrity who had stepped in earlier smiled from across the aisle, catching the family's eye. She gave them a small, encouraging nod. It was a moment of connection, a reminder that sometimes one person's voice could make a difference in a way that changed everything. For the rest of the flight, the atmosphere in the cabin remained friendly and relaxed. The Johnson family, now at ease, could finally settle into their seats and enjoy the luxury they had dreamed of. The incident was behind them, but the memory of how the passengers had rallied behind them, and how the celebrity had used her influence to help, would stay with them forever. As the plane cruised toward their destination, the Johnsons reflected on what had just happened. They had stood up for what was right, and in the end, their persistence had paid off. The journey was far from over, but for now, they were ready to enjoy the rest of their adventure, knowing that sometimes the support of others can make all the difference. The rest of the flight passed without incident. The Johnson family, once filled with anxiety and uncertainty, now sat back and enjoyed the comfort of their first-class seats. The atmosphere in the cabin had relaxed, and the uneasy tension from earlier was gone. Even the flight attendants seemed to carry themselves differently now, offering polite smiles as they moved through the cabin. As the plane flew smoothly through the clouds, the Johnsons allowed themselves to unwind. Jamal and Kira settled in, watching their in-flight entertainment with wide eyes, while Erica leaned back in her seat, breathing a deep sigh of relief. Marcus, too, felt the weight of the tension lift off his shoulders. The ordeal had left him feeling drained, but now, with the flight returning to normal, he could finally relax. Yet, despite the calm, their thoughts kept drifting back to what had happened. They had never expected to find themselves in the middle of such a confrontation. They had only wanted to enjoy their vacation, but instead they had faced an unjust situation that nearly ruined their entire experience. However, it was the unexpected support from the other passengers and the intervention of the celebrity that had turned everything around. As Marcus thought about it, He couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude toward the people who had stepped in to help. It had been a group effort, and in that moment, the support of strangers had made all the difference. It reminded him that sometimes, even in the most difficult situations, people could come together for what was right. The celebrity, sitting in her seat across the aisle, glanced over at the Johnson family once more. This time, it wasn't just a small nod or a smile. It was a genuine, warm look of encouragement. Marcus and Erica returned the gesture, their hearts full of appreciation. They had been strangers to her, but in that moment, she had stood up for them like they were family. "I didn't think we would get through it," Erica said quietly, turning to Marcus. "But we did. We stayed in first class." Marcus smiled. "We sure did. And we didn't do it alone." As the plane neared its destination, a wave of thoughtfulness swept over the Johnson family. They had faced a situation that had tested their patience and their ability to stand up for themselves. But in the end, they realized they had learned something important, not just about the power of standing firm, but about the importance of support from others. The moment was far from over, though. The flight crew had made their final announcement about the upcoming landing, but Marcus, Erica, Jamal, and Kira couldn't help but reflect on everything they had experienced. The support they'd received, the kindness of the celebrity, and the growing unity among the passengers. It was something they would carry with them for a long time. When the plane finally touched down, the Johnson family stood to gather their belongings. As they walked off the plane, they exchanged smiles with the passengers who had shown support, nodding in appreciation. The kindness they had received from strangers had transformed an upsetting experience into one that would be remembered for its lessons in compassion, fairness, and community. As they made their way through the airport, ready to begin their adventure, the Johnson family knew that they had been part of something bigger than themselves. The kindness and support of others had been the key to ensuring that their trip wasn't defined by unfair treatment, but by the strength of unity. It was a moment they would carry with them long after their vacation ended, a reminder that in times of difficulty, people can come together and make a real difference. The Johnson family's vacation had only just begun, but the events on the flight would stay with them for a long time. As they walked through the airport, the excitement of their adventure was tinged with a sense of pride. The struggle they had faced on the plane had been difficult, but it had also brought them closer together and reminded them of the importance of standing up for what was right. While they waited for their luggage at the baggage claim, Erica turned to Marcus, her eyes thoughtful. "I keep thinking about how much support we got. It wasn't just the celebrity, was it? It was the other passengers, too. Everyone came together." Marcus nodded. "It wasn't just us fighting for what's right. It was everyone around us. People don't always speak up, but when they do, it makes all the difference." As they talked, they reflected on the kind words from the other passengers. It had been a turning point. At first, they felt completely isolated, caught in an unfair situation. But when others began to stand up for them, everything changed. The weight that had pressed down on them seemed to lift, replaced by a new sense of hope and connection. The children, who had been watching their parents closely throughout the ordeal, now seemed to feel the shift too. Jamal, who had been quiet throughout most of the flight, now spoke up with excitement in his voice. "Mom, Dad, did you see all the people who helped us? That was really cool." Kira nodded eagerly, her eyes wide. "Yeah, they didn't even know us, but they helped. That was nice." Erica smiled at her children. "Yes, it was. It's a reminder that even when things are tough, there are good people out there who want to help." Marcus agreed. "We didn't face this alone. And that's something we'll always remember." The rest of the day passed with the family slowly getting back to the excitement of their trip. They explored the city, took in the sights, and laughed together as they talked about the plane incident. The children were happy again, excited about the fun ahead, and the parents, though still reflecting on what had happened, were able to put it behind them. They were grateful for the positive turn the situation had taken and for the powerful lesson it had given them. As the day came to an end, Marcus and Erica shared a quiet moment while watching the sunset. The air was warm, and the sky was painted with soft hues of pink and orange. It felt peaceful, but it also reminded them of how quickly things could change, how unexpected moments could shift the course of a day or even a life. "It feels like everything's back to normal now," Erica said, resting her head on Marcus's shoulder. "But I don't think I'll ever forget what happened." Marcus wrapped his arm around her. "Neither will I. And I don't think we should forget. We learned something important about standing up for ourselves, about the kindness of others, and about how people can come together to make a difference." As the family sat together, watching the sun dip below the horizon, they knew this moment was more than just a vacation memory. It had become a story of unity and compassion, of finding strength in unexpected places. The Johnsons had started their trip hoping for an adventure, and they had certainly found one. But the real adventure had been the reminder that no matter where they went, no matter the challenges they faced, they could always rely on each other and on the goodness of others to make things right. This was a lesson they would carry with them forever.